So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Nicole Verdes.
Thanks everybody for coming out today. My name is Nicole Verdes. I am the managing director of Lambda Archives. And for folks that don't know, the mission of Lambda Archives is to collect, preserve, and share the local LGBTQ plus history of San Diego, Northern Baja California, and Imperial Valley region. So how many people here know where Diversionary Theater is or have been to the theater? Yes. Okay, so we are actually in the same building as Diversionary. We have a rather small space kind of hidden in the back. I always say that Lambda is one of the best kept secrets. I feel like I should stop saying that or else it's not going to become a secret anymore. But the reason Lambda and Diversionary, I'm just going to give you a brief history of how we ended up in that space together. That building used to be a psychiatrist's office. And the individual that owned the building was Fritz Klein. He was an Austrian bisexual researcher. He came up with something that was similar to the Kinsey scale, but for bisexuality. He had several papers, documents. He wrote several books. And he was also a huge advocate of the arts. And he loved Lambda Archives and he loved Diversionary Theater. So when he passed away, he said, you know, I want you both to have this building. We don't own it, Diversionary does, but he's like, I would love it if these two organizations that I care so deeply about as an arts and culture advocate could partner together and be in the space. So that's how we ended up in that building in University Heights. So when you think about an archives, we have what you would normally think of. We do have obviously the brick and mortar location where we have photographs, old negatives, protest signs, papers. We have a lot of collections from elected officials like Chris Kehoe, Tony Atkins, Todd Gloria, things like that. Pretty much anything you can think of. And like Patrick said, last year for the first time, we partnered with the Studio Door and we shared one of my personal favorite collection we have in the archives is the Queer Artist Project. And that project was actually started by a couple of former Lambda Archives board members, one of whom was Bruce Kamerling, who became former board president of Lambda Archives. So last year we had a ton of beautiful art that we have from our Queer Artist Project collection here in the gallery. It was awesome. So a couple months ago or earlier this year, Patrick said, why don't we partner again and we can come up with a different thing to display, something from your collections at the archives. And he said, why don't we try to get some art from Bruce Kamerling, who was so involved with Lambda. And Bruce Kamerling was not only the former board president of Lambda, but he was also involved in SOHO, Save Our Heritage organization here in San Diego. He was at his core a preservationist, an artist, and I'm a lesbian, but I will tell you he was a devastatingly handsome man. We have a portrait of him in the archives and I see it every day when I walk in, and he was very handsome, and he did end up passing away from AIDS, unfortunately, in 1994, I believe. But anyways, Patrick said, why don't we make the focus of this year's exhibit Bruce Kamerling's art? And I said, great, I'll do it. So I went to our archivist at Lambda and I said, can you do me a favor and pull the Bruce Kamerling collection? I want to look at it. I want to see what pieces we might loan to Patrick for an awesome exhibit, kind of showcasing his art. And our archivist gave me his collection and I started going through it. And there wasn't really any art in it, you know, so I started to panic. I thought, oh shit, I'm going to have to go back to Patrick and say, we don't have any Bruce Kamerling art, but all that's in these boxes are notes and papers. That's it. So I don't know if anybody here has ever done research in an archives, but one of the beautiful parts of the work that we do is every collection is kind of like a treasure hunt. You know, the more you dig, the more you find, and sometimes what you find leads you to other things. So I thought, well, even though there's only these papers and letters in here, I'll start skimming through a few and see if I can find something that gives me some inspiration or maybe leads me to something else that I can hopefully now go back to Patrick and say, I have another idea. And the first note I pulled out was a handwritten note with, I hate to call them doodles because it almost feels like reductive, but it was a doodle from Robert Miles Parker, who some of you probably know him. He was an artist and he also was a preservationist. He was one of the founders, or I believe co-founders of SOHO. And it was a doodle of a building in Bankers Hill, and it was so intricate and so detailed that it was so cool. But the thing that really captured my attention was that at the bottom it said, "Dear Bruce, you were wonderful last night." And I was like, what's this? And so it really kind of piqued my curiosity. Like, were they lovers, or what was going on here? So I started going through each and every one of the notes, and there were dozens and dozens and dozens of notes that they would write back and forth to each other. And the ones from Robert Miles Parker would, again, every time, a more intricate, a more interesting design. And I had never heard, obviously I skew a little bit younger, I'm 47, so I didn't know who Robert Miles Parker is. I know it might sound like a crime to some people in this room, but I didn't know who he was. So digging through the collection, I learned that he was an artist that drew mostly buildings. He did a few books. He was known for doing a cross-country tour in the United States. And again, I'm just going to use the word doodle, but understand that it's far beyond that and far more beautiful than that word really encapsulates. But he did a cross-country tour and would doodle buildings. He had a book that was released of doodles of like the Empire State Building and other notable buildings in New York, and several here in San Diego. He had a gallery here. And the notes some of them were longer than others, but some of them were maybe just a sentence or two back and forth to each other with these doodles. And what I started noticing is that they started, first of all, the notes and the letters span 2 decades. And when they start in the 70s, the tone was very much, these were 2 younger gay men. They were talking about parties. They were talking about how fun last weekend was, everything. It was like this some of them were hypersexual, and then when you get to the 80s, I don't think the word AIDS appears once in any of the notes or any of the letters. They never say it, but you can feel the shift in emotion, almost like a kind of a drop. And with each note ending with a note like, "I hope your health is well. I hope you're taking care of yourself. I love you. I know I see you." It almost started they became very tender. So it was incredible to really see this depiction through these very brief notes. They weren't long letters, but you could get that sense that Robert Miles Parker was in New York. He was partying in the 70s. Bruce would fly out to see him. They were talking about it. And then in the 80s, it was kind of a more somber tone. The other person that Bruce communicated with regularly was Paul Cadmus, who was an artist, and he worked mostly in oil paintings, but he used a technique called Patrick, maybe you'll know, egg tempera. Am I saying that right? Yep. Where he would use egg as like a binding agent for his paintings. And Paul was much older than Bruce. And those notes, they also wrote back and forth to each other. It was more of a mentor-mentee relationship. Interesting fact about Paul Cadmus that I learned doing my research is that he was the first artist to be a recipient of an artist funding program through the New Deal. So the New Deal, when it was launched, actually had a set of funding to provide funding for artists. And based on the research I've done, it seems that he was the first gay man to have received that funding. And he did a series of murals in New York. And he was this very kind of more distinguished. The notes between Robert Miles Parker and Bruce Kamerling were a bit more personal. The letters that were in the collection between Bruce and the letters between Bruce and Robert Miles Parker were more personal. The ones between Bruce and Paul Cadmus were more, I really appreciate your work. Thank you so much. Have you considered this? Would you like to come to a show? But it still captured the change in the tone over the decades. So one of the things I wanted to touch on here today too is the importance of community archives, because they're absolutely different from what you would think of in terms of an institutional archives. Institutional archives are very they're kind of sterile. I think of people like almost in a lab coat, kind of going through these documents and not having a personal connection. The thing that separates community archives from institutional archives, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because it's so important to this project, what started happening was I was able to reach out to people in the community that knew these men to ask them, were they lovers? Did they, were they just friends? Do you know any more about them? Institutional archives, you normally don't do that. You're just reading and grasping what you can from the collections, from other works, other readings. But in a community archives like Lambda, I was able to reach out to Chuck Kaminsky, who's the board emeritus at Lambda, and knew Bruce Kamerling. Chuck is also a preservationist, and say, do you have any tea on these guys? Like, were they actually hooking up? What was going on? Chuck was able to connect me with several former board members from Lambda Archives from the late 80s, early 90s that said they didn't believe they were lovers, but it was possible, but they didn't know for sure. And through making that connection with Chuck, we were also able to connect with the San Diego History Center, who had a lot of artwork from Robert Miles Parker, which became really valuable as an enhancement to the exhibit that features the letters. So again, the reason I mentioned that is because that's such a cool part of what I do every day, is that sometimes these treasures, these mysteries that unfold within the collections, I'm able to simply pick up a phone and call somebody, if not the person themselves, somebody that knew them personally, and try to kind of get the background on what it is that they knew, what additional information they have, what other connections can be made in terms of art or whatever it happens to be. So yeah, I think that was what we loaned Patrick for this. That's why the exhibit is called Dear Bruce, is because the notes start out with Dear Bruce almost every single time. And the anchor for the exhibit is the longest of the letters, which is from Paul Cadmus, and I believe it was written in 1974 or 6. But just a really beautiful connection. And I also want to name that I'm a lesbian. Usually when I get really excited about a project, it usually centers women. That's my jam. That's where I usually gravitate towards. So when I started doing this project, to be frank, I was like, this isn't normally my deal. But that first note, all it took was for me to read the words, "You were wonderful last night." And all of a sudden I became like this nosy, like, what's going on here? It was just, and it was so beautiful. Some of them actually did, I got a little choked up. And like we heard earlier, the younger generation, and I consider myself kind of right in the middle. I remember AIDS very well. I don't claim to have had personal relationships with people at the time because I was young. I was 10, 11, but it's certainly very ingrained in my mind. That is also the beauty and the magic of archives, is that it can, depict those stories in a way that's deeply personal, and younger folks will never understand. They weren't there. They're not going to it's not something that you can, transfer down to younger generations, but it's important to try to pass that history on and try to explain it in a way that's relatable. And these letters, the notes, the art, it was all deeply, deeply personal and really, really touching and beautiful. So I'm happy that we got a chance to display them here, and hope you get a chance to read through some of them. Thought maybe it would take me a couple of hours to go through these letters and pick which ones I wanted. It took a couple of days because I couldn't take my eyes off of the notes. Not only were the drawings and the pictures beautiful, but it tells a story through decades, and they're priceless. And it made me wish that these men were still alive, all three of them, because I would have called them and said, "Hey, we're doing this exhibit." Again, going back to the community archives and the importance of it, it made me a little sad. It was like I kind of felt their loss, but there was a beauty in that too, is feeling the deep connection and the emotional part of the letters and their lives. So yeah, we as a community archives and we're a really small nonprofit, really small. So part of the community archives aspect is that we really do rely on the community to donate materials to us. Some larger institutional archives have a huge budget where they go out and they buy things or they bid on things to add to their collection. We don't have that, and we don't do it that way. So we really rely on people really walking through our doors and saying, here's a box, we have this. So we would love to have that history. We would certainly love to if anybody had anything like it.